All right, settle in for a moment, but I have to tell you something quietly unsettling. We think of medieval Europe as loud, chaotic places during the day, full of blacksmiths, market calls, and livestock. But at night, it became something else entirely. Not peaceful, not calm, just silent, in a way that made people afraid to breathe too loudly. As the sun slipped below the tree line, the village didn't relax, it braced itself. Work stopped early, not because people were tired, but because darkness belonged to things humans did not control. There were no streetlights, no warm, glowing windows you see in paintings. There was only firelight, flickering and unreliable, pushing back the immense, pressing night for a few fragile hours. Imagine your home. Now, imagine it as a single room. This is where everyone slept. Children, parents, grandparents, and often even the animals brought inside for safety. Privacy, as we know it, simply didn't exist. Warmth and security mattered far more. Doors were barred shut with heavy wooden beams. Shutters were closed and latched. Any valuable tools were pulled inside from the yard. Night was not a time for a casual stroll. If you were caught outside after dark without a very good reason, people would assume you were either lost, desperate, or up to no good. You became a source of suspicion. The vast forest that surrounded every village transformed at night. During the day, it was a place of work and resources, wood for fuel, food from foraging, materials for building shelter. But as soon as the light faded, it became a place where sounds moved without bodies, where branches snapped without a breeze, where the hoot of an owl sounded less like a bird and more like a dire warning. People genuinely believed the dark hid things, spirits, demons, the wandering souls of the unshriven, and the old pagan remnants that the new faith hadn't fully erased. Even the most devout Christians would reflexively cross themselves before daring to step outside into the blackness. The church bell, a constant companion throughout the day, rang one last time at dusk. This wasn't a call to prayer, it was a boundary marker, a signal. Once that final bell tolled, the entire village entered into a quiet, unspoken agreement with the night. You stay out there, we'll stay in here. Inside the small, smoky homes, fires burned low to conserve wood. The evening meal was simple, eaten in near silence. Conversation, if it happened at all, softened into whispers. Stories were told, but carefully. No one ever mocked the dark. You didn't dare test it. Children were sternly warned not to stare out the cracks in the shutters for too long. Not because something would look back, necessarily, but because something might notice you looking. Sleep came early, but rest was a different matter. Beds were often just piles of straw on the floor, maybe a rough woolen blanket if you were lucky. These makeshift mattresses shifted and rustled with every movement. Bodies ached from a long day of manual labor, and lice. Lice were a constant, itching companion. In the profound, silent, dark, dreams felt intensely vivid, almost real, as if the world outside was quiet enough to listen in on your thoughts. Every single sound was magnified and carried meaning. The crunch of footsteps on the dirt path outside. Who was that? A dry cough from a neighboring hut. Is the sickness spreading? The distant, frantic barking of dogs, reacting to something utterly unseen. In the dead of night, fear grew louder than hunger. Illness always felt worse after sunset. Fevers would spike in the darkness. A dull ache would sharpen into stabbing pain. It's said that people prayed more fervently after the sun went down than at any other time. A small, precious candle might be burned beside a sickbed, not for light, but as a ward for protection, a tiny beacon of faith against the shadows. Death often came quietly in the night. Someone just stopped breathing. A child, an elder, wouldn't wake up. By morning, the village would have another body to prepare, another grave to dig. But for now, through the long, dark hours, the village just waited. The only ones truly awake were the monks in the nearby monasteries. Their sacred duty was to hold vigil. Their prayers and chants stitched the night together, punctuated by the ringing of liturgical bells. The villagers believed these holy recitations formed a spiritual shield, keeping the true evil of the night at bay. Whether they actually did or not didn't really matter. The belief itself was the barrier. Time moved strangely at night. Without clocks, the hours were a mystery, guessed at by the state of your own body or how much of a candle had burned down. Sleep rarely came as a long, unbroken stretch. It came in pieces, interrupted by noises, discomfort, or anxiety. Periods of wakefulness in the pitch black felt dangerous, a time when the mind was vulnerable. Outside, the night belonged to the animals, the sly foxes, the howling wolves, all the creatures that people rarely saw during the day but whose presence they constantly felt, their imagined shapes lurking just beyond the firelight. But inside, the night belonged to thoughts, regret, faith, and most of all, fear. People replayed the day's events in their minds. Mistakes and arguments weighed so much heavier in the dark. Promises to God were made in desperate whispers. Tomorrow was something you hoped for, not something you assumed would come. Eventually, sheer exhaustion would win. Breathing would slow. One by one, the small homes would fall into a shallow, fitful sleep. And above it all, the night continued, patient, watching, waiting for the first hint of dawn. Because in medieval Europe, night wasn't just the absence of day. It was a different world entirely, a realm you survived by staying quiet, staying inside, and hoping you wouldn't be noticed. This was the nightly reality for millions of people for centuries. We'll explore what happened when that silence was broken in part 2. Thanks for watching. And if you found this journey into the past interesting, consider subscribing for more. Night did not end all at once in a medieval village. It loosened its grip, slowly, reluctantly, like an unwelcome guest that never wanted to leave. Long before the sun even thought about rising, people began to wake. Not because it was morning, but because sleep could only last so long in the bone-chilling cold. Imagine it. A man stirs beside his wife, his joints stiff, his breath a visible cloud, even indoors. In a corner, a child whimpers, half awake, dreaming of a warmth that isn't there. Somewhere in the village, a fire has burned too low, and the creeping frost returns. The very first sound of the approaching morning wasn't birdsong, it was coughing, the deep, chest-tracking cough of someone whose lungs were struggling against the damp, smoky air. Illness lived in the winter air. It festered in the damp straw bedding. It clung to the smoke that filled every room. People listened to coughs with an expert ear. They knew which ones meant trouble. A soft, dry cough was nothing. A wet, persistent cough was a warning. Morning prayers often began before the first hint of light, not in grand churches, but whispered in humble beds. People murmured words they had learned as children, passed down through generations. These were short prayers, practical prayers. They weren't asking for wealth or joy. They were simply asking for survival. let us see the sun again. In a world so fragile, that was more than enough. Then, someone rises to tend the fire. The packed earth floor is cruel to bare feet. The cold bites immediately, a sharp, painful shock. But the fire mattered more than comfort. Without it, the day could not truly begin. Wood cracks and hisses. Embers glow with a fierce orange life. Smoke billows up, filling the single room again, burning the eyes, coating the lungs. But no one complained. Smoke was a familiar discomfort. It was better than the unforgiving cold. The animals stirred too. Chickens clucked impatiently from their corner. A pig, a valuable source of future meals, shifted its massive body with a grunt. Livestock often slept inside with the family because their shared body heat mattered more than the smell. And after a while, the smell wasn't even noticeable. It was just the scent of home. Morning meals were simple, always simple. Again, a thick porridge of water and grain, perhaps with whatever scraps survived the winter. Sometimes a piece of dried onion for flavor. Sometimes nothing at all. Eating wasn't about enjoyment. It was maintenance for the body, fuel for the long day ahead. Children ate quietly, having learned early that complaining changed nothing. Parents often watched their children eat, ensuring they had enough before finishing their own meager bowls. Hunger was managed strategically. It was a simple, brutal calculation. Not everyone could be full. After eating came work, always work, even in the depths of winter. Clothes were layered, stiff with age and wear, rough spun, wool scratched at the skin. The linen undergarments felt thin and inadequate against the chill. Shoes were precious. A cracked sole could lead to frostbite. Frostbite could lead to infection. And infection, in this age, could easily mean death. So shoes were tied carefully. Hands were wrapped in scraps of cloth. Faces were covered against the biting wind. Outside, the world was pale and unforgiving. Fresh snow muffled every sound, creating an eerie silence. Footprints lingered longer than they should, a stark record of every movement. The village felt exposed, a tiny collection of huts against a vast white landscape. The fields slept under a blanket of ice. The tools waited, cold and idle. Nothing grew. Winter work was about preservation. It was about fixing what broke, mending what was torn, and counting what remained. It was about guarding the little you had with a fierce determination. Men would chop wood, but slowly, conserving their strength. Every swing of the axe was measured. Women spun thread endlessly, their hands in constant motion, turning raw wool into the means to make or mend clothes. Children had their own chores. They fetched water, a difficult task that often involved chipping through ice. They carried messages from one hut to another, their small forms bundled against the cold. No one wasted movement. Energy was a currency, and winter was an expensive season. The forest loomed nearby, a dark, brooding presence on the edge of the village. During the day, it felt manageable, a source of wood and perhaps game. But as the light faded, it felt alive and menacing. Strange tracks would appear in the snow. Wolf prints were common, but sometimes human prints were found. And that, somehow, was worse. Travelers rarely arrived in winter. Those who did were often desperate, and they brought stories with them. Stories of other villages burned by raiders, of sickness spreading like wildfire from one town to the next, of hunger so severe that people were reduced to eating the bark from trees. These stories traveled faster than the people who carried them, and fear traveled faster than both. By midday, the weak, watery light had already begun to fade. Winter days were short and miserly with their sunlight. The sun never seemed to climb high enough in the sky to offer any real warmth. It was just enough to remind people what warmth felt like, a fleeting memory before the cold reclaimed everything. The church bells would ring, not to celebrate anything, but simply to mark the passage of time. Without them, the short days and long nights would blur together into a single, gray existence. People needed structure to survive the psychological toll of winter. Faith provided structure. Routine provided structure. Without those anchors, panic could easily creep in. Afternoons were quieter still. There was less work to be done in the fading light, more waiting. People huddled close to their fires. Talk was low and hushed. Stories were repeated, the familiar ones, the comforting ones. New stories, like the ones travelers brought, made people uneasy. In this world, change was almost always dangerous. And then, as true darkness approached again, the preparations began anew. Doors were checked and barred. Animals were secured. Wood was stacked high inside. Candles were counted. You never lit more than was absolutely necessary. A candle was a luxury. Night returned like an old, familiar enemy, unchanged, unbothered. The family gathered again, the circle drawing tighter as the world outside disappeared into black. Sleep was approached cautiously. It wasn't welcomed like a friend. It was simply accepted as a necessity. People would lie down in the cold and the dark, knowing that anything could happen before morning. A child might not wake up. A fever might rise in the night. A noise outside might not be the wind. And yet, exhaustion always won. Bodies eventually gave in. Minds drifted into uneasy dreams. The village disappeared into the dark once more, waiting, breathing, enduring. Because life in a medieval village wasn't about seeking comfort or happiness. It was about lasting. It was about survival. And every night survived. Every morning you opened your eyes to the gray light was a victory. A victory that no one ever celebrated out loud, but one that was felt deep in the bones of everyone who woke to face another day. Thanks for watching. If you find these glimpses into the past as fascinating as I do, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more. We'll see you next time. Night settled deeper now. Not the early darkness of evening, but the heavy, settled dark that came after people had stopped talking and fires had been banked low. This was the most dangerous hour. Not because something always happened, but because this was when something could. Inside the cottages, breathing filled the silence, slow, uneven, sometimes interrupted by a cough or a restless turn on a straw mattress. Sleep in a medieval village was never complete. It was more like drifting in shallow water, always half aware, always listening. A log shifted in the fire. Someone stirred. Outside, snow fell lightly, absorbing sound, until the world felt wrapped in cloth. Villages at night were never truly quiet. They were simply muted. The wind pressed against walls made of mud and wood. Thatched roofs creaked under frost. Smoke drifted upward through roof holes, carrying warmth and human scent into the dark. That scent traveled far. Animals knew it. So did men. Somewhere beyond the fields, a dog barked. Not sharply, not alarmed, just once. Then silence returned. Inside one cottage, a woman lay awake longer than she wanted to. Her body was tired, but her mind would not settle. She counted breaths, her husband's first, then her own. She listened to her children sleeping. Each small sound reassured her. A shift of weight, a sigh, life. She had learned never to take silence for granted. A quiet child could mean trouble. In winter, sickness often came without warning. A fever could rise in the night. A child who went to sleep breathing easily could wake gasping for air, or not wake at all. This was why mothers slept so lightly. Fathers, too. No one admitted it. Morning without everyone. The fire crackled softly. Not enough to warm the room fully, just enough to keep death at bay. The fire was the heart of the home. It was watched the way a modern person watches a heartbeat monitor. If it failed, everything followed. Outside, the village paths were empty. No lamps, no torches. Darkness ruled completely. Travel at night was rare. Only fools or desperate people moved in the winter dark. Those who did were remembered, sometimes found, sometimes not. In a cottage near the edge of the village, an old man woke coughing. His chest burned. Each breath felt heavy. He sat up slowly, careful not to wake his wife. She was smaller than she used to be. The cold had taken weight from her, from everyone. He reached for water. The cup was cold enough to sting his lips. He drank anyway. Water or ale, it didn't matter. The relief was brief. He leaned back and closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he told himself. If he could make it to tomorrow, he would be fine. People believed that often. Sometimes it was true. Sometimes it wasn't. Further down the village, a young boy dreamed of summer, of running barefoot through grass, of warmth so thick it wrapped around his legs. He kicked in his sleep. His blanket slipped. Cold found his feet. He whimpered and curled tighter without waking. Bodies learned how to survive without thought. Instinct took over. The animals slept too. Chickens huddled together for warmth. Sheep pressed flank to flank. The pig snored, deep and steady. Animals understood winter. They did not question it. They endured. Outside, the forest watched. Trees stood motionless, their branches heavy with snow. Under that snow, things moved. Mice tunneled, foxes stalked, wolves waited. Winter brought hunger to everything, not just people. The moon appeared briefly through a break in the cloud cover, a pale, cold disk. It touched the village without warmth. For a moment, shadows sharpened. Then clouds closed again, and the world was plunged back into darkness. Medieval nights were long, longer than modern ones. Without artificial light, darkness stretched endlessly. Time slowed. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like something to be survived. People did not expect comfort from the night. They expected endurance. Some woke during these deep night hours, not from fear, but from habit. From centuries of living in split sleep, they would rise quietly, feed the fire, say a prayer. Sometimes they talked softly with a spouse. This hour belonged to thoughts, to memory, to worry. A woman remembered her mother. A man remembered a bad harvest. Someone remembered a child buried last winter. Grief moved freely at night. Daylight kept it busy, but the night let it speak. But even grief was measured. Too much thinking drained energy, and energy was life. Eventually, sleep returned, heavy, necessary, the kind that felt like sinking into the earth. Bodies gave in. Fires burned low again. Hours passed unnoticed. Then came the first sign of change. Not light, sound. A rooster shifted on his perch. He didn't crow yet, but his feathers rustled. That was enough. Somewhere in the village, a man half woke, not fully, just enough to recognize the sound. Morning was coming, not warmth, not relief, just another day, another cycle, another chance. The rooster crowed, once, then again, sharp and demanding. The village stirred. A woman sighed, a child groaned. A man sat up slowly, his joints stiff. The fire needed feeding, water needed fetching. Life resumed. Darkness loosened its grip reluctantly. Winter did not end, but the night did. And for the people who lived this life, that was enough. One more sunrise meant one more survival, one more breath, one more day closer to spring. No one celebrated it. They simply rose and began again. Thank you for joining us in the quiet hours of a medieval night. If you found this journey into the past compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more historical explorations. We'll see you again soon. Morning arrived without ceremony. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic shift in the sky, just a slow, gradual thinning of the darkness. A soft, hazy gray replaced the deep black. It was the kind of light that didn't offer any warmth, but simply made the shapes of the world visible once more. Inside the small cottages, people began to stir, not quickly, not eagerly. Their movements were stiff, hesitant. The biting cold made every joint ache and complain. A man swung his legs off his straw mattress and paused, letting his feet find the ground slowly. The packed earth floor was frozen solid. The chill sent a jolt upward through his bones and muscles, but he stood anyway. Someone always had to be the first to rise. The fire in the hearth was nearly dead. Only a few embers remained, glowing a dull, tired red like sleepy eyes. He crouched low, shielding them with his body, and blew gently. It was a delicate balance. Too hard, and the last traces of heat would vanish. Too soft, and nothing would happen. This was a skill learned through necessity, passed down through countless generations. Finally, a spark caught, then another. A thin, hopeful flame licked upward. He added small pieces of wood with careful precision. The fire returned to life. It wasn't strong, not yet, but it was alive. For now, that was enough. Across the room, his wife began to move. She didn't open her eyes, not right away. She listened. The sound of a living fire meant the day could officially begin. The children were allowed to sleep longer. It was a small mercy the adults granted them. The couple moved quietly, speaking mostly in glances and gestures. Words seemed to waste precious heat. As the fire grew, smoke thickened, clinging to the low ceiling and further blackening the thatched roof. Eyes stung and lungs accepted the familiar irritation without protest. It was just another part of life. Outside, the sounds of creaking doors echoed through the village. One by one, the community reassembled itself. Figures wrapped in heavy wool stepped out into the frigid air. Their breath rose in pale clouds before them. No one lingered. The cold punished stillness. At the village well, a thin layer of ice had formed overnight. A man broke it with a stone he kept nearby for this exact purpose. Water surged upward, and buckets were filled with numb, hurried hands. No one complained. Complaining didn't change winter. Back inside the cottages, the first meal of the day began to take shape. It wasn't breakfast, not in the way we think of it. It was simply sustenance. A pot of pottage simmered slowly over the fire. Barley, peas, whatever remained from the autumn harvest. The pot had to be stirred constantly to keep its contents from sticking and burning. Burned food meant wasted fuel, and nothing was ever wasted. A woman tasted the pottage, then added a little more water, stretching it. She would stretch it again at noon, and then once more at night. The children woke up hungry, as they always did. They ate without talking, the steam from their bowls warming their small faces. For a moment, the relentless cold retreated. It wasn't defeated, just pushed back a little. The men prepared to leave. Work didn't stop for winter. The fields might be sleeping under the snow, but obligations did not. Wood needed to be cut, fences needed mending, and the Lord's land needed tending. 3 days a week belonged to him, regardless of snow or cold. A man wrapped his cloak tighter around his shoulders and checked his boots. They were stuffed with wool for extra warmth, but the leather was cracked and stiff from the frost. He ignored it. He would mend it later, if later came. Before leaving, he gently touched his sleeping children. It was a habit, a small reassurance in an uncertain world. He stepped outside into a landscape of white and gray. The village paths were narrow, clearly marked by trampled snow. Everyone followed the same lines. Straying from the path meant sinking knee-deep into the snow, a costly waste of energy. And in winter, energy was everything. The forest loomed beyond the fields, dark and still. The tall trees seemed to watch without judgment as the men entered cautiously, axes resting on their shoulders. They moved with measured breath and worked slowly. Working too fast meant sweating. Sweat in this cold would freeze, and frozen sweat could kill. So they worked with a steady, deliberate rhythm. One swing of the axe, a pause, another swing, then a moment to listen. The sound of steel biting into wood echoed softly through the trees. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a branch cracked under the weight of snow. No one spoke, but everyone listened. Fear was a quiet thing in winter. It didn't shout, it simply waited. Back in the village, the women worked too. Their tasks were endless: spinning wool, mending clothes, cleaning. Their hands moved automatically while their minds wandered. They thought of summers past, of lush green fields, and the sound of children laughing. They remembered a warmth that felt almost unreal now. One woman stopped her spinning for a moment and stared at nothing. Her thoughts drifted to the previous winter, to the child who didn't survive it. She pictured the small, frozen grave by the church wall. She forced her hands to move again. Thinking too much invited sorrow, and sorrow drained the strength needed for survival. The animals were checked on. Their water was thawed, and their straw bedding replaced. They lived close to the people for a reason. Their shared warmth mattered. A pig was given a comforting scratch behind the ears. A sheep's side was pressed gently. Its warmth meant it was healthy, and its health meant future meat for the family. The day crept forward. The sun never truly arrived. It was just a brighter shade of gray. Shadows softened slightly. The church bell rang at midday. A single, heavy note rolled across the quiet village, signaling noon. Bowls were filled again. The same food, but slightly thicker this time. The pot was scraped nearly clean. Children licked their spoons, and the adults ate in silence. No one rushed. After eating, there was a brief moment of rest. Not sleep, just stillness. Their bodies needed it. The afternoon dragged on. The wind picked up, shifting the snow into new drifts, and the cold seemed to sharpen its edge. A woman layered another shawl around her shoulders. Her fingers ached. Her spinning slowed. Her mother had warned her that winter stiffened the hands, year by year, until one day they simply stopped obeying. She flexed them carefully and continued her work. Evening arrived early, as darkness slid back in to reclaim the world. Fires were fed, doors were barred, and the animals were settled for the night. Families drew close together, finding comfort in each other's presence. Night came again, and with it, a familiar uncertainty. A cough sounded from one cottage. It was deep and wet. A woman's face tightened with worry. She brought water, then a bundle of dried herbs. She used what little knowledge she had learned. Sometimes it helped, sometimes nothing did. Quiet prayers were whispered. God didn't need shouting. He heard everything. Old stories were told, the same ones repeated night after night. The stories didn't need to be new. They needed to be familiar. Familiar meant safe. Children leaned against their parents, their eyes heavy with sleep, their bodies finally warm. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and snow brushed against the walls. The world shrank to the small circle of firelight and the sound of shared breath. As the night deepened, people slept. But it was a light sleep, always light. When the fire dimmed, someone would wake to feed it. Someone always did, because the fire was life, and the cold never slept. The hours passed, then fewer still. The rooster in the coop shifted on its perch. The cycle was preparing to begin all over again. And in that quiet village, in the grip of that endless winter, survival continued. It wasn't heroic or dramatic. It was just persistent. Day after day, night after night, holding on, waiting, enduring. Night deepened until even memory felt distant. The fire burned low again, not dying, just resting. Its steady glow held the darkness at bay. Most of the village slept, but sleep was never complete. It came in layers. Light sleep, half waking, always listening. A woman stirred when the wind pressed harder against the wattle and daub wall. She did not open her eyes. She counted breaths instead. Her child was warm beside her. Her husband still breathed. That was enough to rest again. Outside, the village sounded different at night. Wood creaked under the weight of snow. The snow itself shifted and settled with a soft sigh. Animals moved softly in their pens, their quiet rustling, a familiar comfort. Sometimes a dog barked, just once. Then silence returned. Dogs did not bark without reason. Everyone knew that, and so fear traveled quietly, not as panic, but as a heightened awareness that threaded through the silent homes. In one cottage, a man sat awake longer than usual. His cough had worsened. Each breath rattled in his chest, a harsh, unwelcome sound in the quiet room. His wife sat beside him, not speaking, just present. Her hand rested on his arm, a simple point of contact. Warmth mattered, so did touch. They both knew the truth, unspoken but heavy in the air. The winter sickness chose its own path. You could fight it. You could pray to every saint you knew. You could simply wait. The result came when it came, indifferent to your hopes. Somewhere else, an older woman woke naturally. No cough, no fear, just age. Sleep loosened its grip a little earlier each year. She rose slowly, her joints protesting the cold, and fed the fire with practiced, careful, economical movements. She remembered winters long past, before her hair turned white like the snow outside, before her hands stiffened with work and time, before the faces she loved had faded into the earth. She had outlived so many. Survival was not a victory, it was endurance. The new kindling caught, and she sat back down, wrapping her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. She waited for morning. Time moved strangely at night. Without clocks, without the sun to mark its passage, Hours stretched or shrank according to mood and wakefulness. Sometimes the darkness felt endless, a vast ocean to cross. Sometimes dawn seemed to arrive far too soon. In another house, a child whimpered in their sleep. Nightmares were common. The dark fed the imagination with ancient fears. A mother murmured softly, her voice a low hum, a prayer, a promise, a simple reassurance. The child settled back into the warmth of the straw mattress. Night did not forgive fear. It simply absorbed it. In the forest that ringed the village, movement continued. Animals hunted. Paws pressed softly, almost silently, into the deep snow. Eyes adapted to the gloom, reflected the faint moonlight. They instinctively avoided the scent of fire, the smell of smoke, the presence of people. But hunger grew bold in winter. It drove them closer to the village than was usual, nearer than comfort allowed. The villagers knew this too. It was another layer of the night's quiet tension. Inside the stone church, a few blessed candles burned, their tiny flames flickering against the immense cold. The priest slept in his small room nearby. The thick stone walls held the cold longer than wood and thatch, but they also held something else. Faith lived there, even at night, especially at night. Far away, in distant monasteries, monks were already chanting their matins, their voices stitching the dark hours together with prayer. Many people believed those chants mattered, that they formed a shield of sound against the evils of the night. Belief itself was a form of warmth. Back in the cottages, dreams came and went. Some dreamed of food, of full bellies and endless summer harvests. Some dreamed of the sun on their faces. Some dreamed of nothing at all. Dreamless sleep was a rare luxury. The body remembered hunger even while the mind was resting. A log shifted in a fire pit, and a cascade of ash collapsed. The sound was enough. Someone woke, their senses instantly alert. They fed the fire, nudging the embers back to life, and returned to their bed. The night was divided this way, not into hours, but into responsibilities. No one slept deeply for long. Someone always had to be listening. The cold pressed harder just before dawn. This was a truth the body knew instinctively. The air sharpened, and breath thickened into white plumes. Frost crept inward from the edges of the doorframe. The fire was fed one last time. The wood was chosen carefully, dry enough to catch but dense enough to burn slow and steady. It needed to last until morning proper, then quiet again. The entire village seemed to hold its breath, waiting. On its roost, the rooster shifted, feathers rustled. Outside, the sky lightened, so imperceptibly, at first, that you might think you'd imagined it. The deep black of the sky softened to a dark gray. Darkness thinned. Night, like a tired traveler, began to loosen its grip. Morning approached, not gently, but reluctantly, as if the world itself resisted waking from its cold slumber. Inside the cottages, people fell into their second sleep. This was the deepest, most complete rest. Dreams softened, bodies finally relaxed. The hardest hours were over. Survival had won another night. Soon the cycle would begin again. The fire would be built up, water would be fetched. Food, if there was any, would be prepared. The long day of work would start. But for now, in this brief, precious window between the deepest dark and the dawn, there was rest. And in medieval Europe, rest itself was a fragile gift, one taken carefully, one guarded closely, one earned night by agonizing night. Thank you for watching. Morning didn't arrive with light. It arrived with cold, a deeper cold than the night before, sharp and demanding, the kind that settled into your bones before you were even fully awake. Eyes would open slowly. Bodies stayed still, clinging to any shred of warmth. No one rushed to greet the day because, in the heart of winter, the day had nothing kind to offer. Breath fogged the air inside the small cottage, a pale cloud rising and vanishing with each exhale. Somewhere nearby, embers glowed faintly in the fire pit, barely alive, a tiny orange heart barely holding back the dark. Someone had to move first. Someone always did. A man eased himself upright, careful not to disturb the fragile pocket of warmth shared between the sleeping bodies beside him. His bare feet touched the packed earth floor, and he froze for a moment, letting the icy shock pass upward through his legs. Pain was expected. Pain was a familiar companion. He crouched near the fire pit and fed it slowly, a few twigs, a piece of dried wood. He shielded the embers with his body, blowing just enough breath to coax a flame back into existence. A spark caught, then another. Flame returned, small but obedient. The day could begin. Across the room, a woman stirred without opening her eyes. She listened to the fire before she moved. The crackle of a healthy flame meant survival. It meant another chance. The children slept on, curled into tight balls, their small bodies instinctively conserving every ounce of heat. Hunger would wake them soon enough. It always did. The cooking pot was lifted and set above the growing flame. Ice in the water bucket cracked as it was poured. A handful of grain rattled into the bottom of the pot, fewer kernels than yesterday, but more than they had feared. The woman stirred the mixture slowly, watching carefully. Burned food wasted precious fuel, and wasted food wasted lives. Outside, the village began to reassemble itself, piece by piece, from the frozen landscape. Doors opened reluctantly, groaning on their leather hinges. Snow crunched under worn boots. Familiar paths reappeared as hundreds of feet pressed the same lines into the frozen ground. At the communal well, a thick layer of ice had formed again. It always did. A heavy stone was used to break it, the sharp crack echoing in the still air. Water surged upward. Buckets were filled quickly, the rope stiff with frost, hands burning with a painful cold. No one spoke. Breath was precious. Words could wait. The men prepared to leave the village, not because winter allowed it, but because obligation demanded it. There was always forest work, felling trees for fuel and repairs. The Lord's land still claimed its share of their bodies and their time, winter or not. Cloaks were pulled tight. Boots were checked for cracks, any gaps stuffed with wool or rags to keep out the biting wind. A woman stood in her doorway, watching her husband adjust his belt. She noticed how thin his cloak had become, how the fabric no longer held its shape the way it once did. It was a silent worry, a fear she kept to herself. He touched her arm once, briefly, a silent exchange of reassurance and anxiety. Then he stepped into the white and gray world beyond the village, disappearing into the falling snow. Inside the cottages, the work never stopped. Spindles turned, drawing wool into thread. Needles flashed in the dim light, mending torn clothes, creating new ones. Cloth grew slowly, thread by thread, hour by hour. Every garment was a future winter negotiated in advance, a battle won before it was fought. Children sat nearby, too cold to play, too too young to fully understand why this enforced stillness mattered so much. They listened, they watched, they learned without being taught, absorbing the rhythms of survival. Midday arrived without warmth, announced only by the sound of the church bell ringing once, its heavy tone echoing across the snow-covered fields. Bowls were filled again. The pottage was thicker now, stretched with more water to make it last. When possible, the children ate first. The adults smiled and pretended to be full, their own hunger a constant, low hum in the background, something the body simply learned to ignore. The afternoon dragged on under a sky that never truly brightened. The wind pressed harder against the Waterland daub walls. Snow whispered against the thatched roofs. As the hours passed, fingers slowed. Pain flared in joints that had been worked too long and too hard. Hands were flexed, shaken out, and then the work continued. Stopping now only meant worse pain later. A man returned early from the fields, not injured, just emptied. Winter drained a person's strength, quietly, without drama or complaint. He sat near the fire, his eyes closed, resting without sleeping, just listening to the crackle and pop that meant warmth, that meant safety, still held. In another cottage, a cough returned. It was softer than before, wetter, but it was present. People noticed. They always did, but no one named it. Giving a name to an illness felt like an invitation, and in the close confines of winter, sickness could move faster than a wildfire. Evening came early again, darkness reclaiming the village before anyone felt ready. Doors were barred. The few precious animals were fed. The chickens quieted in their coop. The sheep pressed together in their pen, their woolly bodies creating a shared blanket of warmth. The pig turned in its straw and grunted, content. The animals mattered. Their heat mattered. Their health mattered. The fire reached its brightest point of the day, a brief and precious climax. Faces glowed in the orange light. For a moment, the world felt smaller, safer. Conversation softened. Stories returned. Old and familiar tales, chosen not for excitement, but for reassurance. The children leaned in, their eyes wide. The adults listened too, even when they pretended not to, finding comfort in the well-worn words. Outside, something moved near the forest edge. The dogs lifted their heads. They let out a single, low growl, then stopped, listening intently. Silence returned. Whatever it was, it had passed. Night deepened, settling over the village like a heavy blanket. Candles were lit sparingly, their light flickering as the precious animal fat dripped slowly. Shadows stretched and shifted on the walls, turning familiar objects into strange, looming shapes. Sleep came unevenly, arriving in fragments. Dreams were heavy, filled with cold, hunger, and half-remembered summers. In the middle of the night, the fire dimmed. Someone woke without thinking, nudged by instinct. Have you ever felt like you're constantly chasing time, racing against a clock that never stops? Well, what if I told you there was a time when people didn't chase time at all? A time when, instead of moving forward, time simply pressed down. In medieval life, time wasn't something you ran after. It was something that sat heavily on your shoulders. Every morning felt heavy before it even began. People didn't wake up refreshed. They woke up continued. Yesterday didn't really end. It just paused long enough for a bit of sleep. Morning simply meant resuming the unfinished business of survival. Clocks were rare, almost meaningless. The body was the only true calendar. Pain measured the hours. Hunger measured the days. The biting cold measured the seasons. And in winter, time moved differently. It slowed down, stretched out, lingering in every single task. A simple chore, like fetching water, wasn't a quick trip to the tap. It was a journey. Every step mattered. Every spilled drop was a loss. Everything required intention. Nothing was automatic. There was no rushing. Rushing wasted precious energy, and energy was life itself. So, people learned to move slowly, deliberately, efficiently. Speed was for emergencies, for danger. The fast often died first. Time felt circular. The same meager meals returned. The same prayers were repeated day after day. The same stories were told around the fire. This repetition created a sense of stability, and stability meant safety. Change was deeply unsettling. New ideas felt risky. If something worked, even if it hurt, it stayed. The pain was at least familiar, and what was familiar was survivable. People didn't ask themselves, "What do I want to be when I grow up?" They already were something: a farmer, a wife, a laborer, a child. Your identity was inherited, not chosen. And time reinforced these roles. Every season confirmed who you were. Spring meant planting. Summer meant exhaustion. Autumn brought the fear of a poor harvest. And winter, winter meant pure endurance. There was no break between these roles. Rest wasn't leisure, like a vacation. Rest was repair. Bodies needed time to recover from the constant strain, but that recovery was never complete. People aged quickly. A 30-year-old carried the physical weight of many decades. Hands became hardened and calloused. Spines curved under the load. Faces weathered like old leather. Time left its marks early. Childhood was brutally short. Children worked as soon as they could stand. Play existed, but only briefly. Responsibility arrived early, and it stayed forever. Time did not forgive mistakes. A single bad harvest could mean starvation for years. One illness could reshape an entire family. One injury could end your usefulness. And being useless meant being dependent, which meant being vulnerable. Time punished weakness. But it also rewarded patience. Those who waited survived. Those who endured lasted. Waiting was a skill. Knowing when not to act was just as important as knowing when to act. The weather taught timing. The soil taught patience. And faith. Faith taught surrender. There was a profound belief that time belonged to God, not to people. This belief helped to ease the constant fear. If time hurt, it was for a divine purpose. If suffering lasted, it had meaning. And meaning is what makes pain bearable. Without meaning, pain simply breaks people. Medieval life survived, in part, because it found a way to explain pain. Time wasn't empty. It was filled with purpose. Even tragedy fit into a larger pattern. Death wasn't seen as random. it was scheduled by God. This belief didn't erase grief, but it softened the blow of loss. People mourned deeply, but they accepted the outcome. Acceptance was survival. Anger was a waste of energy, and time doesn't respond to anger. It just moves on, slowly, relentlessly. So people learn to live inside the waiting, waiting for the harvest, waiting for the dawn, waiting for sickness to pass, waiting for death. This constant state of waiting shaped their minds. It created a space for introspection, for silence, for deep observation. Think about our modern lives. We seek distraction at every turn. Our minds are constantly pulled away by noise, by screens. But in the medieval world, there was only the wind, the crackle of a fire, the sound of your own breathing. Time pressed inward, not outward. Thoughts deepened, beliefs strengthened, fear matured, and hope. Hope became something very practical. Hope wasn't for grand, far-off dreams. It was for enough food to last the week. It was for surviving one more winter. It was for healthy children. Hope lived in the immediate future, just a few short steps ahead. Long-term planning was for the lords and ladies. A peasant planned for the coming weeks, not for the coming years. This small horizon helped to reduce disappointment. People didn't imagine futures they could never reach. They accepted their limits, and in those limits, they found a strange kind of clarity. Life was brutal, but it was understandable. Time also reinforced the social hierarchy. The Lord's time was more important than anyone else's. The church controlled the calendar, and the ringing of its bells defined the hours of the day. People obeyed the sound. Sound was authority. Yet time was also deeply communal. Everyone rose together. They worked together. They rested together. Individual schedules didn't really exist. This created a powerful sense of belonging. Loneliness was rare, though privacy was even rarer. But isolation was deadly. Being together saved lives. Time was shared. Grief was shared. Labor was shared. And when night fell, it arrived for everyone equally. In this way, time humbled all. Kings aged, children died, plagues ignored social status. Time did not negotiate. It consumed everyone equally. And in that unavoidable truth, there was a quiet kind of equality. Everyone, from the lowest peasant to the highest king, bowed to time. Everyone ultimately lost to time. But until that moment came, people lived inside it, moment by moment, task by task, breath by breath. There was no rush to finish life. There was only persistence. Time pressed down, and people stood under its immense weight, and somehow they didn't collapse. They adapted, they endured, they lasted. So, tonight, as you get ready to rest, remember that you don't always have to chase time. It moves whether you follow it or not. You are allowed to slow down, to breathe, to just exist. The medieval world survived by waiting, by enduring. You can rest now. Time will carry you forward. Thanks for watching. If this story made you think, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more journeys into the past. See you next time. Night did not end all at once in a medieval village. It loosened its grip, slowly, reluctantly, like an unwelcome guest that never wanted to leave. Long before the sun even thought about rising, people began to wake. Not because it was morning, but because sleep could only last so long in the bone-chilling cold. Imagine it. A man stirs beside his wife, his joints stiff, his breath a visible cloud, even indoors. In a corner, a child whimpers, half awake, dreaming of a warmth that isn't there. Somewhere in the village, a fire has burned too low, and the creeping frost returns. The very first sound of the approaching morning wasn't birdsong, it was coughing. The deep, chest-tracking cough of someone whose lungs were struggling against the damp, smoky air. Illness lived in the winter air. It festered in the damp straw bedding. It clung to the smoke that filled every room. People listened to coughs with an expert ear. They knew which ones meant trouble. A soft, dry cough was nothing. A wet, persistent cough was a warning. Morning prayers often began before the first hint of light, not in grand churches, but whispered in humble beds. People murmured words they had learned as children, passed down through generations. These were short prayers, practical prayers. They weren't asking for wealth or joy. They were simply asking for survival. Let us see the sun again, in a world so fragile that was more than enough. Then someone rises to tend the fire. The packed earth floor is cruel to bare feet. The cold bites immediately, a sharp, painful shock. But the fire mattered more than comfort. Without it, the day could not truly begin. Wood cracks and hisses. Embers glow with a fierce orange life. Smoke billows up, filling the single room again, burning the eyes, coating the lungs. But no one complained. Smoke was a familiar discomfort. It was better than the unforgiving cold. The animals stirred too. Chickens clucked impatiently from their corner. A pig, a valuable source of future meals, shifted its massive body with a grunt. Livestock often slept inside with the family because their shared body heat mattered more than the smell. And after a while, the smell wasn't even noticeable. It was just the scent of home. Morning meals were simple, always simple. Again, a thick porridge of water and grain, perhaps with whatever scraps survived the winter. Sometimes a piece of dried onion for flavor. Sometimes nothing at all. Eating wasn't about enjoyment. It was maintenance for the body, fuel for the long day ahead. Children ate quietly, having learned early that complaining changed nothing. Parents often watched their children eat, ensuring they had enough before finishing their own meager bowls. Hunger was managed strategically. It was a simple, brutal calculation. Not everyone could be full. After eating came work, always work, even in the depths of winter. Clothes were layered, stiff with age and wear, rough spun, wool scratched at the skin. The linen undergarments felt thin and inadequate against the chill. Shoes were precious. A cracked sole could lead to frostbite. Frostbite could lead to infection. And infection, in this age, could easily mean death. So shoes were tied carefully. Hands were wrapped in scraps of cloth. Faces were covered against the biting wind. Outside, the world was pale and unforgiving. Fresh snow muffled every sound, creating an eerie silence. Footprints lingered longer than they should, a stark record of every movement. The village felt exposed, a tiny collection of huts against a vast white landscape. The fields slept under a blanket of ice. The tools waited, cold and idle. Nothing grew. Winter work was about preservation. It was about fixing what broke, mending what was torn, and counting what remained. It was about guarding the little you had with a fierce determination. Men would chop wood, but slowly, conserving their strength. Every swing of the axe was measured. Women spun thread endlessly, their hands in constant motion, turning raw wool into the means to make or mend clothes. Children had their own chores. They fetched water, a difficult task that often involved chipping through ice. They carried messages from one hut to another. their small forms bundled against the cold. No one wasted movement. Energy was a currency, and winter was an expensive season. The forest loomed nearby, a dark, brooding presence on the edge of the village. During the day, it felt manageable, a source of wood and perhaps game. But as the light faded, it felt alive and menacing. Strange tracks would appear in the snow. Wolf prints were common, but sometimes human prints were found. And that, somehow, was worse. Travelers rarely arrived in winter. Those who did were often desperate, and they brought stories with them. Stories of other villages burned by raiders, of sickness spreading like wildfire from one town to the next, of hunger so severe that people were reduced to eating the bark from trees. These stories traveled faster than the people who carried them, and fear traveled faster than both. By midday, the weak, watery light had already begun to fade. Winter days were short and miserly with their sunlight. The sun never seemed to climb high enough in the sky to offer any real warmth. It was just enough to remind people what warmth felt like, a fleeting memory before the cold reclaimed everything. The church bells would ring, not to celebrate anything, but simply to mark the passage of time. Without them, the short days and long nights would blur together into a single, gray existence. People needed structure to survive the psychological toll of winter. Faith provided structure. Routine provided structure. Without those anchors, panic could easily creep in. Afternoons were quieter still. There was less work to be done in the fading light, more waiting. People huddled close to their fires. Talk was low and hushed. Stories were repeated, the familiar ones, the comforting ones. New stories, like the ones travelers brought, made people uneasy. In this world, change was almost always dangerous. And then, as true darkness approached again, the preparations began anew. Doors were checked and barred. Animals were secured. Wood was stacked high inside. Candles were counted. You never lit more than was absolutely necessary. A candle was a luxury. Night returned like an old, familiar enemy, unchanged, unbothered. The family gathered again, the circle drawing tighter as the world outside disappeared into black. Sleep was approached cautiously. It wasn't welcomed like a friend. It was simply accepted as a necessity. People would lie down in the cold and the dark, knowing that anything could happen before morning. A child might not wake up. A fever might rise in the night. A noise outside might not be the wind. And yet, exhaustion always won. Bodies eventually gave in. Minds drifted into uneasy dreams. The village disappeared into the dark once more, waiting, breathing, enduring. Because life in a medieval village wasn't about seeking comfort or happiness. It was about lasting. It was about survival. And every night survived. Every morning you opened your eyes to the gray light was a victory. A victory that no one ever celebrated out loud, but one that was felt deep in the bones of everyone who woke to face another day. Thanks for watching. If you find these glimpses into the past as fascinating as I do, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more. We'll see you next time. Night in medieval Europe did not arrive gently. It fell heavy and absolute, like a curtain pulled across the world. When the sun disappeared, so did safety, clarity, and certainty. There were no glowing windows, no distant traffic hum, no electric reassurance. Darkness meant darkness, the kind that pressed against the eyes and made even familiar paths feel foreign. When the final church bell rang and doors were bolted shut, the world contracted into small pools of candlelight, surrounded by endless black, foremost medieval people. Night was not a time for productivity or reflection. It was something to endure, something to survive. Houses were built to keep the cold out, not the dark. Thick stone walls trapped shadows inside, and once the fire dimmed, corners vanished into silence. A single candle was precious, expensive, and dangerous. Many families chose darkness over flame, trusting memory to guide their steps rather than risking fire. Sleep itself was fragile. Beds were not private sanctuaries, but shared spaces. Entire families slept in the same room, sometimes in the same bed. Straw mattresses rustled with every movement. Fleas and lice were constant companions. Blankets were heavy, rough, and rarely clean. Yet exhaustion always won. Bodies worn down by labor surrendered quickly, slipping into shallow sleep, broken by sound, cold, and fear. Medieval sleep did not follow our modern pattern. People often slept in two phases. The first sleep began shortly after nightfall and lasted several hours. Then came a waking period in the deep of night. During this time, some prayed, some talked quietly, some checked on animals or stirred dying embers. Others simply lay awake, listening. After an hour or two, a second sleep arrived, carrying them toward dawn. This rhythm felt natural in a world ruled by fire and darkness, not by clocks. Outside the home, night belonged to uncertainty. Roads vanished. Forests became something else entirely. Familiar trees turned into looming shapes, and every sound carried a threat. Wolves roamed closer to villages after dark. So did thieves. So did men with no work, no land, and nothing to lose. Traveling at night was rare and dangerous. If you were on the road after sunset, it was assumed something had gone wrong. Cities were not much safer. Medieval towns locked their gates at night. Watchmen patrolled the streets, calling out the hours to remind everyone that time was still moving even when sight was gone. Their voices echoed through narrow lanes, sometimes comforting, sometimes eerie. Crime increased after dark, and punishment was swift. Being caught outside without reason invited suspicion. Darkness itself made you guilty. The medieval mind filled the night with meaning. Darkness was not empty, it was crowded. Demons, spirits, and wandering souls were believed to move freely after sunset. Nightmares were not just psychological events, but spiritual attacks. Sleep paralysis was explained as a demon sitting on your chest. A sudden waking with a racing heart meant something had passed through the room unseen. The night was alive, watching, waiting. Church teachings reinforced this fear. Darkness symbolized sin, temptation, and chaos. Light meant order, God, and safety. This belief shaped behavior. Windows were small, streets were narrow. Buildings leaned inward, shrinking the sky above. Everything pushed people toward the center, toward light, toward community. Night reminded everyone how thin the line was between protection and exposure. Fire was the fragile barrier. Hearths were the heart of medieval life, especially after sunset. The fire warmed, cooked, and comforted, but it also demanded constant care. Letting it die meant cold and darkness. Letting it grow too strong meant death by flame. Fires destroyed entire towns. Still, people gathered around them every night, drawn by the only light they could trust. The silence at night was deeper than anything we know. Without engines, without electricity, without constant noise, the absence of sound was complete. When something moved, it mattered. A creaking beam, a distant howl, a knock at the door could freeze a household in fear. Sounds traveled farther in the dark. Imagination filled the gaps. Medieval people feared illness most at night. Fevers often rose after sunset. Coughs worsened. Pain felt sharper in the dark. Without our modern medicine or understanding, sickness became spiritual. A child crying through the night might be cursed. A sudden death by morning meant something had visited. Night turned the body into a mystery and the soul into a battleground. Dreams were taken seriously. They were messages, warnings, or temptations. A dream of falling meant moral failure. A dream of fire meant divine anger. People confessed their dreams to priests. They sought meaning in the images their minds created while resting. Sleep was not an escape. It was exposure. Despite all this, night also offered a rare stillness. After relentless labor, the dark forced rest, the fields lay quiet, tools were set aside. For a few hours, there was nothing to do but exist. Even fear softened under exhaustion. The body, once still, slowly surrendered its tension. Breathing deepened, thoughts blurred. Darkness wrapped around the mind like a heavy cloak. Monasteries treated night differently. For monks, darkness was structured. Bells divided the night into prayer hours. Sleep was interrupted deliberately. Rising in the cold darkness to chant psalms was an act of discipline. It trained the mind to obey rhythm over comfort. Even in sleep, order ruled. For peasants, there was no such control. Night came when it came. Sleep ended when animals stirred, or children cried, or the cold crept in. Dawn was relief. Light meant survival again. Another day lived was a small victory over the dark. Over centuries, this relationship with night shaped behavior that still lingers in us today. We lock our doors instinctively. We fear darkness without knowing why. Silence can make us uneasy. We fill the night with light, sound, screens, and noise to push back something ancient, something learned when darkness truly meant danger. Medieval people did not romanticize the night. They respected it. They endured it. They waited for morning. And yet, wrapped in that deep darkness, under layers of wool and straw, listening to the slow breath of others nearby, sleep came anyway. Not perfect, not peaceful, but necessary. The medieval night was not designed for comfort. It was designed by nature, belief, and limitation. And still, humanity adapted. Bodies learned when to rest. Minds learned when to surrender. Even fear learned to sleep. As the hours passed and the sky slowly lightened, roosters crowed. Fires were stirred. Eyes opened. Another night survived. Another day earned. And somewhere deep in that ancient rhythm, the pattern of human rest was written, not in clocks or schedules, but in darkness, silence, and the simple need to close one's eyes and let go. The cold does not end at dawn. It loosens its grip just enough to let you believe the day might be easier than the night. Then it settles back into your bones as the hours pass. Winter doesn't attack all at once. It wears you down quietly, patiently, the way water wears down stone. You wake knowing this, not as a thought, but as a feeling already waiting inside your body. The morning light arrives thin and pale, filtering through the oiled linen window, without warmth or promise. not for fairness, but for peace. Hunger breeds anger faster than cold ever could. Your husband eats slowly. Your breath forms clouds that drift away as if eager to escape you. The village looks smaller in winter. Snow pulls everything inward. Distances shrink. The world feels contained, as if folded in on itself for safekeeping. You move carefully, placing your feet where others have already walked, trusting shared paths more than your own judgment. At the well, ice has returned. It always does. Warmth is never still. It must be constantly reclaimed. The kind that comes quietly, without celebration, when the ground softens and the days stretch longer without being asked. Winter does not only drain the body, it teaches the mind to grow quiet. After enough cold mornings and long nights, thoughts stop racing ahead. You stop imagining outcomes. You stop asking when things will change. Your mind learns to exist only where your body is, in the slow rhythm of breath, fire, and waiting. This is not despair, it is adaptation. It is how people survive seasons that refuse to hurry. The morning arrives without ceremony, no sunrise worth naming, just a gradual thinning of darkness until shapes return to the room. The fire has held through the night, not strong, but alive. Alive is enough. Your husband wakes with less effort today. He moves slowly, carefully, as if testing the world before fully re-entering it. His cough returns, but it does not command the room the way it once did. It is a sound that belongs to him now, not something that threatens to take him away. You listen anyway. You always listen. The children wake hungry. This is a good sign. Hunger means strength. Hunger means growth. You pull them close before they leave the blankets, letting them steal warmth for a few more breaths. Childhood is brief, even in summer. In winter, it feels like something that must be protected fiercely, quietly, without explanation. Outside, the village moves slower today. Snow has deepened overnight. Paths are narrower, doors open later. Winter tightens its grip, not through violence, but through accumulation. A little more cold, a little more weight, a little more effort required for the same tasks. You choose not to go to the well immediately. The water can wait an hour. Your body tells you this morning must begin gently or not at all. Instead, you clean the space around the fire, scraping ash into a corner, clearing room for the day's work. Order matters when everything else feels uncertain. Your mother spins without looking at her hands. You say winter comes when it comes, and people do what they must. Evening always brings it. Night is when winter feels closest, when the walls feel thinner, and the fire feels smaller. You prepare carefully. More wood placed within reach, water checked, blankets shaken and redistributed. Dinner includes a small gift, a sliver of salted pork dropped into the pot. Not much, just enough to change the smell, just enough to remind everyone that reserves still exist. Morale matters. Winter does not kill only through hunger. It kills through hopelessness. The smell spreads slowly, filling the room with memory of better meals, of shared feasts, of times when eating did not require calculation. The children notice immediately. Their eyes brighten. Your husband exhales, a sound close to relief. Night settles fully. The rush light flickers. Shadows move in ways that make the room feel alive. The fire crackles softly, speaking a language you have learned to trust. Outside, snow continues to fall. It hushes the world. Sounds fade. Even the wind seems gentler, muffled by white. There is a strange peace in heavy snowfall. Everything is slowed. Everything is covered. The dangers remain, but they feel distant, as if held at arm's length. During the waking hour, you rise again. The fire needs feeding. Your body moves without complaint. This hour has become familiar, a pause between sleeps, a moment when the world feels suspended, neither night nor morning. As you tend the flames, you think about how winter has changed you, not in ways you can name easily. You are not stronger, not braver, but quieter, more precise, less wasteful in thought as well as action. Winter has stripped away excess. You return to bed. The children shift. Your husband reaches for your hand without opening his eyes. His grip is firm, present. Not scenes, just sensations, warmth. The sound of breath close to yours. When you wake again near dawn, the world feels slightly different, not warmer, not brighter, but steadier, as if winter has paused, if only to catch its breath. The rooster crows, later than usual. Even he seems tired. Morning returns quietly. No announcements, just the continuation of life where it left off. You sit up slowly. Your body protests less than yesterday. That surprises you. Outside, the sky holds a hint of softness, still gray, but lighter. You do not call it hope, you call it observation. Your husband coughs once, then not again. You notice. You store the moment carefully, like a coin saved for later. The day begins, and winter, for all its persistence, feels for the first time not endless, but finite. Winter does not announce its turning point. It never declares that the worst has passed. Instead, it loosens its grip so slowly that you almost miss it. The morning feels the same as yesterday at first. Cold air resting low in the room. Ash settled thick in the hearth. Breath visible when you exhale. But there is a difference. Your body notices before your mind does. The cold no longer bites immediately. It waits. You rise without rushing. There is no reward for speed in winter. Only efficiency, only care. The fire answers quickly when you feed it, flames catching faster than they did weeks ago. Wood that once hissed now burns with confidence. You store this detail away. Fire is honest. It reflects the world as it is. Your husband sleeps later today. When he wakes, he sits without coughing, not because the sickness is gone, but because his body has learned how to hold it. You have learned to celebrate these small victories quietly. Loud hope attracts disappointment. The children eat steadily, less complaining, less staring at empty bowls. Their bodies, like yours, have adjusted. Hunger still exists, but it no longer dominates. This is not comfort, it is endurance. Outside, the village carries the same muted rhythm. People speak less, gestures replace words. Winter strips language down to what matters. A nod, a shared glance, an unspoken understanding that everyone is doing the best they can. You do not go far today. Snow remains deep. The paths are narrow and treacherous. Instead, you work inside, turning your attention to what winter forces inward. Clothing mended, tools cleaned, plans revised quietly in your mind. Your mother hums as she spins. The sound is low, barely there, but it fills the room in a way the fire cannot. Music is another kind of warmth. It costs nothing and reminds you that life is still happening beneath the surface of survival. Midday arrives without sunlight. The bell rings, dull and distant, carried weakly through the snow. Time passes even when it feels suspended. You eat again. The pot is thinner. No one comments. Silence has become a form of agreement. Your son asks when spring comes, not why, when. The difference matters. You tell him not soon, but not forever. This answer satisfies him. Children understand waiting better than adults. They have less behind them and more ahead. The afternoon drags, heavy and slow. This is the hardest part of winter. Not the cold mornings, not the dark nights, but the hours in between when nothing changes and energy leaks away quietly. You feel it in your limbs, in the way lifting feels heavier than it should, in the way sitting becomes so tempting. Winter is patient. It does not need to strike hard. It waits for fatigue to make mistakes, so you keep moving, slowly, purposefully. You refuse stillness, not because stillness is dangerous, but because it invites thought. And thought, in winter, can wander to places that weaken your resolve. As evening approaches, the clouds thicken. Snow threatens again. The sky lowers itself like a lid. You prepare instinctively, more wood within reach. Water brought closer to the fire. Blankets shaken, redistributed, layered with intention. Your husband helps without being asked. His movements are careful, but present. This matters more than strength. Presence is what winter tries hardest to steal. Dinner brings no surprises. The same tastes, the same textures, but there is comfort in predictability. When everything outside is uncertain, repetition becomes safety. Night arrives early again. The rush light burns. Shadows stretch. The animals settle. The old dog grunts once, then silence. Even he seems subdued by the weight of the season. You tell no story tonight. Words feel unnecessary. Instead, you sit together, listening to the fire and the distant wind. Silence is no longer awkward. It has become a companion. During the waking hour, you rise alone. Others sleep deeper now. Exhaustion has claimed them fully. You move carefully, respectful of their rest. The fire greets you warmly. It has learned your hands. As you sit by the hearth, you think about waiting. How much of life is spent doing it? Waiting for the weather to change, waiting for sickness to pass, waiting for children to grow, waiting for relief that arrives quietly, almost unnoticed. You realize that waiting itself has become a skill, one your ancestors mastered without ever naming, waiting without wasting strength, without surrendering hope, without demanding guarantees. You return to bed before the cold deepens again. Sleep finds you easily. Your dreams are shallow tonight, drifting images that dissolve before forming meaning. When dawn comes, it brings a subtle gift. Light lingers a fraction longer, not enough to celebrate, enough to notice. The rooster crows later again. Your father rises with less stiffness. Your mother stretches without wincing. Your husband coughs once, then clears his throat and speaks. His voice is steady. You do not say anything. You do not name this moment. Naming gives winter something to challenge. The day unfolds quietly. Outside, the snow does not fall. It rests. The world holds its breath. You step to the doorway briefly. Cold air meets you, but it does not drive you back immediately. You stand there longer than you have in weeks, breathing slowly, feeling the ground beneath your feet. Winter is still here, strong, unforgiving, but it no longer feels infinite. You return inside. The fire crackles. The children talk softly. Life continues. And somewhere beneath the cold and silence, something patient and unstoppable has begun to move again. I hope this finds you well, wherever you are in your own season. Sometimes the quietest changes are the most profound. If you're in a season of waiting, remember that endurance itself is a victory. It's not about grand gestures, but the small, consistent acts of care. Mending clothes, cleaning tools, humming a low tune. These are the things that keep the fire of life burning, even when the world outside is frozen. If this resonated with you, I'd be honored if you subscribed and joined our community. We explore these quiet moments of life together. Thank you for listening, for being present, and for holding space for this story. Until next time, be well and notice the light. There is a moment in late winter when nothing looks different, yet everything feels altered. The snow still lies thick on the ground. The air still cuts when you breathe too deeply. But the weight has shifted. You notice it first in the mornings. The cold no longer feels eager. It lingers instead of attacking. When you rise from the blankets, your body protests less. Not because the floor is warmer, but because you are no longer fighting shock. Winter has taught your nerves what to expect. The fire responds quickly again today. One breath, one nudge, and the embers wake. You do not rush this task anymore. Fire rewards patience. It always has. You sit with it. Your husband moves more easily now. He still carries sickness in him, but it no longer rules his breath. His cough is occasional, no longer commanding attention. You mark this without celebration. Quiet improvement is the kind that lasts. The children eat with focus, less distraction, less wandering of eyes toward the door. Winter has trained them. They understand the rhythm now. They know when to speak and when to be still. Outside, the village begins to sound different, not louder, just less brittle. Footsteps crunch less sharply. Doors creak instead of groan. Even the wind has lost its edge, sliding past walls instead of striking them. You step outside longer today, not far, just far enough to feel the air on your face without retreating. The cold greets you, but it does not chase you back. You stand, breathe, and let your body remember that it belongs to the world beyond the walls. The sky hangs low, heavy with cloud, but there is light in it now. Not brightness, depth. You return inside and work without urgency. Tools are cleaned, not because they must be used soon, but because it feels right to prepare. Preparation is hope disguised as habit. Your mother pauses her spinning to rest her hands. She looks at them thoughtfully, flexing stiff fingers. There is pain there, years of it, but there is also strength, the kind that survives quietly. Midday comes and goes. The bell rings. The sound carries farther than it did weeks ago. Air holds sound differently when it begins to soften. You notice this and smile, briefly, privately. The meal is small, predictable. No one minds. Appetite has settled into something manageable. The panic of hunger has passed, replaced by patience. You have learned that winter feeds on fear more than it feeds on bodies. The afternoon brings restlessness, not exhaustion, but anticipation. It is an unfamiliar feeling after weeks of simply enduring. You feel it in your chest, a subtle tightening that is not anxiety, it is readiness. Your son asks about the fields, whether the ground will thaw soon, whether birds will return. You answer carefully, soon enough, not yet. Enough truth to satisfy curiosity without inviting disappointment. Your daughter listens quietly, fingers busy with her doll. She hums without realizing it, a soft sound that weaves through the room like a promise. As evening approaches, clouds break briefly. The light shifts. For a moment, pale and fragile, it touches the snow and changes its color. The white becomes blue, then silver, then gray again. But you saw it. Everyone did. Dinner is eaten slowly. No one rushes to finish. The fire burns steady. Conversation drifts, low and unimportant. You talk about nothing. This is a gift. Night arrives gently. The rush light flickers, but it feels less desperate now. Darkness no longer presses as close. The room holds itself. You do not tell a story. You do not need to. The season itself has become the story, unfolding without narration. During the waking hour, you rise, as always. The floor still chills your feet, but not painfully. You tend the fire with ease. Your hands know what to do without thought. Just for sound, the wind is distant. The village sleeps deeply. Even the animals rest fully now, breathing slow and heavy. You think about how winter changes people, how it strips away urgency and replaces it with attention, how it teaches the value of waiting without demanding reward. You realize that you are not waiting for spring anymore. You are simply allowing it. When you return to bed, sleep comes quickly, deeper than before. Your dreams are clearer, not images, but feelings, warmth, expansion, space. Morning arrives, almost unnoticed. Light has already crept into the room before anyone wakes. The rooster crows once, then stops. Even he seems unsure. Your father rises and stretches. Your mother smiles at nothing. Your husband breathes evenly. The children stir, unafraid of the cold. You sit up and feel something new. Not heat, not relief, stability. Outside, the snow has begun to shrink, not melt, withdraw. Edges soften. Footprints linger longer. The world holds shape again. You stand at the door and breathe. The air feels different, not warmer, wider. Winter has not ended, but it has loosened its hold. And you, without ceremony, without announcement, have survived another turning of the season. There comes a point near the end of winter when time begins to move again, not quickly, not with any great confidence, but just enough to be felt. You notice it in the most ordinary of ways. The fire in the hearth, for example, no longer demands your constant, anxious attention. The wood seems to burn more evenly now, as if the bitter cold has finally taken a single step back. Ash settles differently in the grate. The smoke rises with less resistance, finding its way up the chimney with a new ease. These are not signs you could easily explain to someone else. They are not grand pronouncements. They are subtle shifts your body understands without the need for words. The morning light is another clue. It reaches farther into the room before anyone in the house even begins to stir. It touches the far wall, a place it never managed to reach during the deep, dark weeks of winter. The light isn't bright, not yet. It's just present, and in the quiet stillness of late winter, presence is everything. Your husband wakes with the light now, instead of being startled awake by the cold before it. He sits up, he stretches, he breathes. The deep, rattling cough that has been his companion for months doesn't interrupt the stillness. There is still a weakness in his movements, yes, but it is the weakness of recovery, not the slow, heavy weakness of decline. You don't comment on it. You let the moment exist as it is, without pressure, without analysis. You just let it be. The children wake slowly, rubbing the sleep from their eyes. They don't immediately complain about the cold, their usual morning ritual. Instead, they notice the light first. Children always notice the light. Outside, the village itself feels less held down, less oppressed by the weight of the season. Doors open a little earlier. People linger a little longer in the open air, their breath still misting before them, but their shoulders a little less hunched. Voices seem to travel farther. The world hasn't necessarily warmed, but it has softened, and that softness invites sound back into the world. You step outside and stand still for a moment, just feeling it. Snow remains, blanketing everything, but it no longer blinds you with its stark, flat whiteness. The surface has changed. It's textured now, detailed. Instead of being a uniform sheet, you can see the faint tracks where others have walked, where animals have passed in the night, where time itself has begun to leave its marks again. You return inside and go about your work without the familiar sense of urgency that has defined the last few months. This is the strange, quiet gift of late winter. There is still nothing to rush toward, no harvest to bring in, no frantic preparations to make. But there is also no longer a need to constantly brace yourself against the biting cold. Your body unconsciously loosens its tight grip, your muscles unclench. Your mother rests more often now, not because she is weaker, but because she knows the spinning can wait. She watches the room as she rests, her eyes following the quiet, familiar movements of her family. There is a deep satisfaction in her stillness, a well-learned peace. Midday arrives and seems to linger, stretching itself out. The village bell rings, and the sound echoes in a way it hasn't for weeks. Sound just travels differently when the air begins to change, when it loses its dense, frozen quality. You eat your midday meal without counting each bite, without the gnawing anxiety of dwindling supplies. Hunger still exists, but it no longer shouts. It's a quiet hum in the background. Your son, your youngest, asks about planting. He asks about seeds, about when the ground will finally open again. These questions feel safe now. They no longer carry the threat of disappointment, the sting of a hope that might be too early. You answer him with a patience you haven't felt in a long time. Soon, you tell him when the earth is ready. He nods, content with the simple idea of readiness. The afternoon carries a gentle restlessness. It's not anxiety, it's expectation. You feel it in your chest, like a held breath that doesn't need to be released just yet. It can be held comfortably, quietly, and then, from outside, a bird calls. Just one, a brief, almost uncertain sound that cuts through the silence. You stop moving when you hear it. So does everyone else in the house. No one speaks. You all just listen. The sound doesn't return, but it doesn't need to. It has been heard. It has done its work. Evening arrives later than it has in months. The light lingers long enough to feel like a gift, a small luxury. Shadows stretch across the snow, but they do not rush to swallow the day. You prepare the fire for the night with care, but not with that old, desperate urgency. Dinner is simple, still thin, still modest, but it is eaten with an ease that has been absent from your table. Conversation drifts aimlessly, not about plans or worries, just observations. The kind of talk that fills the quiet space without demanding answers or solutions. Night settles gently. The rushlight on the table flickers, but the darkness outside doesn't feel like it's pressing against the windows anymore. The room feels larger than it did just a few weeks ago. Space has returned. Later, during the deepest waking hour of the night, you rise again, but you don't feel entirely alone in the darkness. You can hear others stir in their sleep. Your husband shifts his weight. Your mother breathes a little deeper. Even the animals in the barn seem to adjust their positions with less tension. Winter has finally lost its iron grip on the night. You sit by the glowing embers of the fire and think about how long this season has been, how much it has taken, and then you think about how quietly, how subtly it has given something back. Not abundance, not comfort, but understanding. A deep, bone-felt understanding of cycles, of endurance, of the turn of things. You return to bed, and sleep comes easily. Your dreams are calm. They are spacious, the kind that do not cling to you with anxiety when you wake. Morning arrives with a newfound confidence. Light finds its way into the room long before any sound does. The rooster in the yard crows once, a sharp, clear note, and then stops, as if satisfied. Your father rises from his chair and stretches without the familiar wince of pain. Your mother smiles as she gathers her spindle, her hands ready for the day's rhythm. Your husband breathes deeply and nods at you, a silent acknowledgement passing between you. The children move with an energy, a lightness that you haven't seen in months. Outside, the snow has pulled back even further from the house. Small, dark patches of ground are showing through. Waiting, you stand at the open door and breathe in the morning air. It is still cold, yes, but it carries something else now. A current underneath the chill, the promise of movement, the promise of life. Winter has not ended, not yet, but it is no longer in control. Time has returned, and with it, the quiet, unshakable certainty that what comes next will arrive exactly when it is ready. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more quiet reflections.